ever, like, held a really old book, and I mean really old, and wondered how it's actually, still in one piece? Like, we're talking books that have survived for centuries. It's kind of mind-blowing, right?
It really is.
Well, get ready to dive deep, because today we're exploring the world of long-stitch bookbinding.
A method that's as strong as it is elegant.
Totally. It's been used for centuries, and get this, no glue.
We're talking pure craftsmanship here.
Absolutely. And we've got some incredible sources to guide us today. Museum archives, old bookbinding manuals, even some Wikipedia wisdom. You know I love a good Wikipedia deep dive.
Who doesn't? Ready to get stitching.
Let's unravel this history. So, long-stitch bookbinding. How do we even explain this? In the simplest terms, it's binding a book by literally sewing the pages to the cover. Like, no adhesive, just threads holding it all together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a lot more common than people might think.
Right.
Our article from the Metropolitan Museum of Art talks about how in medieval Germany, they used it for these things called limp parchment bindings.
Limp parchment bindings.
Basically, things like stationery or records, stuff people used every day.
Oh, like the medieval version of our notebooks and journals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Except instead of spiral binding or glue, they meticulously stitched it all together.
Wow. What's amazing is that this technique was so practical and affordable that it was accessible to, like, almost anyone, right?
Absolutely. It was about practicality, but it wasn't just about keeping things together. The way they stitched these books, it actually made them really durable.
Oh, that makes sense.
And flexible. And remember, this was a time when books were super valuable and they often traveled huge distances.
Right. They were basically the medieval version of a paperback, designed for rough travel. No kidding. Okay, so we've talked about the history, but let's get into how it's done. This Metropolitan Museum article describes how a modern bookbinder recreated this technique. And get this, they started with corrugated cardboard.
Cardboard. I love that. It really shows how simple this technique can be. They used it to make a model first, just to get a feel for that sewing pattern before moving on to the good stuff.
And when you say good stuff,
We're talking handmade paper, leather, the real deal.
wow. The article even mentions binding a cake box book using this method. Who knew old recipes could be so stylish?
Right. And that's what's so great about this technique. It's adaptable. And that's something that we see throughout history. I mean, our excerpt from Pasted Text talks about how long stitch binding was used for printed books in Italy as early as the 1480s.
1480s. Now, that is a blast from the past. What kind of books were they printing back then?
All kinds. We're talking guidebooks, romances, even play texts, and opera libretti.
Opera libretti. It's amazing what survives, right?
It is. It seems like even back then they had their versions of, like, a beach read.
Something you don't mind getting a little wear and tear on.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that the basic technique is simple, but it can also be so intricate. Different stitching patterns, different threads. Some even had buttons or other embellishments added on.
Oh, wow. So you've got these everyday books being bound, but then also ways to get creative, add that little extra personality.
Our Pasted Text excerpt actually mentions that some long stitch bindings were considered to be works of art.
Wow. It reminds me of something else we found. Our bookbinding excerpt actually mentions a modern artist, Pamela Spitzmuller, who uses long stitch binding in their work. It just goes to show this centuries-old technique still feels relevant and modern today.
Definitely. And there's a resurgence in interest in non-adhesive binding. People are looking for something handcrafted, something unique. Long stitch binding really fits in with that.
Oh, I totally get that desire for something, well, different from what we usually see mass-produced. Okay, let's shift gears a bit here. This bookbinding excerpt also goes into this idea of books as readable objects.
Yes. And how understanding how they're put together, the structure, can actually enhance that reading experience.
Right.
There's a quote in here from a French designer, Legrain, who really believed that traditional bookbinding was, the pinnacle, that it had reached its peak of perfection.
And then, of course, they go on to explain how wrong that idea turned out to be.
Yeah, because it's not just about beautiful objects, right? It's about creating something that's meant to be used, enjoyed, even interacted with. And that means finding the best structure for how that book's going to be used.
Okay, yeah, that makes total sense. It's like finding the right tool for the job. Speaking of which, the excerpt actually describes something called crossed structure binding. And from what I gathered, it sounds really intricate.
It is. Picture like a row of people linking arms.
Mhm.
That interlocking action, that's kind of how the flaps in cross-structure binding work. They create this incredibly strong and flexible spine.
Wow. So it's like combining the elegance of long stitch binding with the durability of a more traditional bound book.
Exactly. But we'll dive into the specifics of cross-structure binding after the break. So we're back, diving even deeper into the world of long-stitch bookbinding and exploring this idea of cross-structure binding. Remember we were talking about it before?
Yeah, it sounds like a total upgrade on a classic design, kind of like a 21st century take on it. And, I'm always fascinated by how these traditional crafts find new life, new interpretations. It's exciting.
It really is. And what's interesting is that the person who came up with cross-structure binding, they were drawn to the same things that probably drew bookbinders to long stitch centuries ago. That direct attachment, that strength.
Right, using the thread to connect the pages directly to the cover.
Exactly. But they also wanted more. Like they wanted to be able to make the spine stronger, which is hard to do with traditional long stitch binding.
That makes sense, because I'm imagining just a stack of paper sewn together. Yeah, but still a little, floppy.
Exactly.
So how did they solve that? Because our excerpt from bookbinding actually gets into some serious detail about this. It's pretty fascinating.
Well, they basically created these interlocking flaps, almost like little straps sewn to the pages, and then these straps interlock to create a really strong spine, which can also be reinforced.
So it's like they've built in extra support right there in the binding itself.
Yeah, exactly. And they didn't stop there.
Mm.
Cross-structure binding also often has this really cool asymmetrical design, which just adds another, visual element to the whole thing.
I love that. It's like they're saying, we're going to make it sturdy and functional, but we're also going to make it beautiful. Why not, right?
Exactly. Function and beauty don't have to be separate things, even with something as technical as bookbinding.
Totally. It reminds me of those medieval bookbinders we were talking about,
Right.
adding those little embellishments, those personal touches. It's like that human need to put our own stamp on things, to make it our own. It's like timeless.
It is a fascinating thought that even back then, we see that desire for both functionality and something more, something aesthetically pleasing.
Definitely. Speaking of those early examples, and this kind of blew my mind when I learned it, but long stitch is actually a misnomer.
Oh,
Yeah, the correct term technically is long sewing.
really? I never heard that.
I know, it's wild. And apparently it comes from the German Langstich. Our pasted text excerpt dives into this a bit.
Huh. You learn something new every day.
Right. But as they point out, the term long stitch is so common now, it's probably not going to change anytime soon.
That's how language works, I guess. It evolves.
Exactly. But it's good to know the origins. And it gets me thinking more practically, were all these different long stitch variations from those early stationery bindings to the more artistic contemporary stuff? What can we, the everyday book lovers take away from all of this? What's the key takeaway?
That is a great question. For me, I think it really highlights the value of craftsmanship. Long stitch binding, it's a reminder that you can create beautiful, durable, lasting things with simple tools, simple techniques. It doesn't always have to be complicated.
It speaks to that human ingenuity. Yes.
And in a world where so much is mass-produced, that feels important to remember.
It does. And beyond that, I think long stitch binding encourages us to see books differently, They're not just containers for information, they're objects to be appreciated,
To be held.
to be explored even, and maybe even to try making ourselves.
I completely agree. There's just something about a physical book, especially when you can see the care that went into making it. It's
It
different.
feels special. And, it's interesting, this appreciation for craft, it's something we're seeing pop up even in our digital age. The popularity of handmade things, the interest in knowing where things come from, how they're made. There's a connection there. I totally agree. And while I don't think we need to ditch our e-readers entirely, there is something magical about a physical book, especially one bound with this level of care. It's like holding a piece of history.
It really is. And those techniques, they're helping keep that history alive.
And it's so interesting, right? Because this technique has been around for centuries and it's still relevant.
Exactly. It's inspiring modern bookbinders, artists, even just people who love to experiment with different crafts.
It makes me think back to that cake box book. I love that example. It shows that these techniques can be applied in so many different ways.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about creativity.
Yeah.
Using what you have, trying new things. What other unexpected materials could we bind, right?
Exactly. The possibilities are endless. Okay, But before we go totally off on a tangent here, we have one more fascinating aspect of long stitch binding to cover. And this one really got me thinking. Remember when we were talking about how they used long stitch for printed books in Italy back in the 1480s?
Oh, yeah, those early guidebooks.
Right. Our excerpt from Pasted Text mentions how this method was actually considered, quote, an inexpensive and convenient way to protect and hold together books. And it makes you wonder, did they think about book preservation back then? Like how we do today, with all the acid-free materials and special storage. It's fascinating.
That's such an interesting point. I mean, they definitely understood that these books needed to be protected, right?
Yeah.
Especially if they were going to be handled a lot or traveling around.
Yeah, it's like their version of a sturdy paperback meant to withstand some wear and tear. And honestly, when I think about the state of some of the paperbacks I've traveled with, it's kind of impressive how well some of those older books have survived.
That's a great point. Even back then, they were thinking about those things, durability, longevity. They were creating objects meant to last.
Which, in a way, is kind of what we're still striving for today.
Absolutely. Whether it's with traditional techniques like long stitch binding or cutting-edge digital methods, right? The goal is the same. It's about preserving knowledge, passing down stories, making sure these things aren't lost.
Beautifully said. And I think that's the perfect note to transition into our final thoughts on this journey through the world of long stitch binding. And we are back for our final thoughts on this incredible deep dive into the world of long stitch bookbinding. It's amazing how, something as simple as thread and a needle can connect us to literally centuries of bookmaking history. It's kind of humbling when you think about it.
It really is. We've gone from medieval scribes to like modern artists,
Yeah.
and they're all drawn to this technique, the
Yeah.
strength, the elegance of it, and like you said, that ingenuity, that human touch.
It's timeless. And it really makes me think about those early long stitch bindings we talked about. Those books, they weren't just practical, right? A lot of them were really beautiful objects. Those little details, the embellishments, the different stitching styles. It's like even back then, they understood that a book could be more than just words on a page.
It could be a work of art in itself.
Exactly. And it's funny because it connects to that quote we talked about earlier, the one from our bookbinding excerpt, about how bookbinding had reached its peak.
Oh, yeah. Like they couldn't even imagine a world where it could evolve beyond the traditional methods.
Right. It's like they couldn't foresee a world where books would become these interactive, dynamic things, objects to be experienced on multiple levels, not just read.
Exactly. And I think it's that shift in perspective from just preserving the information to thinking about enhancing the experience of reading. It's what has led to so many interesting innovations in bookbinding.
Totally. I mean, look at cross-structure binding. It takes those basic principles of long stitch binding, that direct detachment, the strength and flexibility, but then it pushes those boundaries, takes it to a whole other level.
And that's what's so cool about it, that interplay between tradition and like pushing the limits of what's possible. And at the heart of it, it's still about craftsmanship. It's about that beauty of creating something by hand.
I completely agree. It makes you wonder, though, what will be the long stitch bindings of our digital age? What's going to be the next innovation that really captures that same spirit, that blend of artistry, that durability, that ingenuity?
Now that is a question, isn't it? Maybe it'll be about making digital information feel more tangible, or incorporating elements of craft and personalization into digital spaces. Who knows?
It's exciting to think about. Not rejecting technology, but finding ways for it to be more human, more connected to us on that, sensory level. Maybe someday we'll be looking back at the first interactive ebooks or virtual reality libraries with that same sense of wonder that we feel when we encounter a centuries-old long stitch binding. It's all connected.
It really is. The human desire to create, to innovate, to preserve stories and ideas, it transcends time and technology.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What's something in your world, in your own life, that might seem simple on the surface but holds the potential for, endless innovation? What can you experiment with? What can you reimagine?
Ever wonder how we got from, scrolls to the books we know today?
We're uncovering the secrets of a technique used for centuries, the archival long stitch.
Archival long stitch. Sounds kind of intense. What is that exactly?
It's more straightforward than it sounds, but really fascinating. We're focusing on a physical model, actually. It's called Archival Long Stitch, 2001, a prototype from the University of Iowa Libraries.
Okay, so a real tangible thing. What's so special about it?
This prototype represents a binding style common from the 9th to the 15th centuries, used a lot for account books.
Account books. like ancient ledgers.
Exactly. They were crucial for keeping track of transactions and records. Think of them as the historical version of spreadsheets.
Wow, spreadsheets. So this binding method must have been pretty durable if it was used for important documents.
You're right, durability was key. Imagine this. Instead of binding the pages separately and then attaching a cover, they sewed the text block and cover together simultaneously
Sewed them together. How does that even work?
with long stitches, and you can actually see them on the spine. It created an incredibly strong bond between the pages and the cover.
So way more integrated than how we bind books now. It makes sense those account books had to hold up. Why go through all that trouble, though?
Practicality. This method created a book that could really withstand heavy use. Plus, it let the book lay flat, essential for writing and making entries, especially for those meticulous record keepers.
Ah, I get it. Like trying to write in a flimsy notebook versus a nice sturdy one. You need something that can handle constant use. Were these account books being carted around all over the place?
Absolutely. And it wasn't just some niche, localized technique either. This long stitch method was used across northern and southern continental Europe.
So this was the way to bind books for centuries. There must be a reason why it was so popular.
There is. But before we get into that, the prototype we're looking at, it has something called a limp cover, which means it's flexible, not fixed to a board. Just another characteristic of this style.
It's amazing how something as seemingly simple as a book's binding can tell us so much about the past.
Right, and there's more to uncover. The description mentions something called unsupported sewing, which means no extra materials like tapes or cords were used to support the stitching.
Interesting. What's the significance of that?
Well, it suggests a certain level of skill and understanding of the materials. They used what they had effectively. Plus, the prototype uses multi-signature paper.
Multi-signature. Break that down for me.
Basically, signatures are groups of folded pages. Using multiple signatures suggests a collaborative creation process, maybe even multiple authors or contributors for one book.
So we're not just talking about a lone scribe hunched over a candle, painstakingly copying a manuscript. It was a team effort. That changes how we think about knowledge sharing back then.
Exactly. It wasn't always a solitary endeavor. And even with these seemingly simple account books, we see this dedication to craftsmanship.
It's like they took pride in every detail, even back then.
They did. And the prototype description gets even more specific, mentioning UICB flax paper for the end papers. Those are the pages connecting the cover to the text block.
Okay, and flax paper, that was the good stuff, right?
It was. Flax was known for its strength and durability, much better than wood pulp paper, which might explain why this prototype is still around today.
They knew these books were important and they had to last. It's really cool that we can still learn from them all these centuries later. This long stitch method, it's pretty impressive.
Absolutely. And for anyone who wants a closer look, high-resolution images of the prototype are available online.
Oh, wow. So you can zoom in on every stitch. It's like holding a piece of history, virtually at least.
You got it. And this prototype, it's not alone. It's part of a larger collection at the University of Iowa Libraries full of historical bookbinding techniques.
Libraries, the original keepers of knowledge. It's so important that we have places dedicated to preserving these tangible pieces of the past. Each binding style is like a piece of the puzzle, showing us how information was shared and preserved throughout history. And speaking of history, we've only scratched the surface of bookbinding. This long stitch method, it's just one stop on a long and fascinating journey.
Definitely. We're talking about centuries of innovation, changing needs, and how people adapted. And believe it or not, some of those techniques are still relevant today.
Oh, really? That's interesting. How so?
We'll dive into that right after a quick break.
Yeah.
That's right. We were talking about how this centuries-old technique is still relevant today.
Yeah, it's kind of wild to think about, like something from so long ago still being used. What makes the archival long stitch method so timeless?
Well, think about it. Even though mass production churns out most books these days, there's this whole movement toward handcrafted, bespoke bookbinding.
Like those fancy journals and sketchbooks.
Yeah.
The ones with all the cool covers and stuff.
Exactly. And they use techniques that come straight from those historical methods, like the long stitch.
So some of those artisans, they could be using a version of the same technique that was used on those account books we talked about.
It's true. And it shows how powerful certain techniques can be. It's not like they disappeared because they didn't work. They evolved, adapted to what people needed. That long stitch, with its strength and simplicity, it's still a valuable tool for bookbinders.
It's like sometimes the best way forward is to look back, see what worked in the past, and find ways to make it work now. not always about reinventing the wheel.
Exactly. And it all comes back to that archival long-stitch 2001 prototype. That object, sitting there in Iowa, it's not just a window to the past. It's proof of how clever people were, how much skill they had.
It's like, it's easy to forget that history was real people, making real things. It can feel so distant sometimes. But this prototype, it's a reminder that these were carefully crafted objects.
And the things we use every day, the things we take for granted, they could be those objects someday, for people way in the future. Imagine someone finding a smartphone in 1,000 years.
That's a trip. We're all making history, even if we don't realize it. But, okay, let's get back to the long stitch. We've talked about how practical it was. But was it, like, pretty? Did they care about that back then?
That's a great question. Of course, they needed it to work well, but they cared about how it looked, too. Remember the prototype description mention a wooden button?
Yeah, a button on a book. Kind of strange.
Right. Well, they probably weren't just decorative. They might have had a practical use, too, like keeping the book shut tight, or maybe even letting you attach it to a belt.
Books were valuable back then. You wouldn't want to lose one. It's cool how they combined looks and function.
Totally. And the archival long stitch 2001 prototype. It's just one example, but it shows a larger trend. For example, let's talk about the long stitch itself, how it changed over time.
Wait, so there were different kinds of long stitches. It wasn't just one standard way of doing it.
Nope. This prototype uses a specific pattern. It's called a long and link stitch. Basically, they interlinked the long stitches, which made it even stronger, and it looks cool too. Shows how creative these bookbinders were, always experimenting, refining the technique, making it their own.
So even back then, people were putting their own spin on things. It's inspiring to see that desire to innovate, no matter the time period.
Absolutely. And that spirit, it wasn't just for fancy manuscripts or religious books. It was for everything, even those everyday account books we keep talking about. They put that same care and skill into them.
It's like a totally different mindset than today, right? Like they built things to last, not to be thrown away.
Very true. But like we were saying, that old way of thinking, it's still alive. People are rediscovering those old techniques and making amazing things.
It's a good reminder that even though we live in a digital world, having those physical connections to the past, like that archival long-stitch prototype, is super important. It's what keeps those stories alive.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And now, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked a lot about the history and the techniques. But what about the lasting impact? How did these binding methods shape how we think about books today? We'll explore that right after this.
We're back and ready to dive into the lasting impact of those historical bookbinding methods we've been talking about. It's incredible how something as seemingly simple as binding a book can hold so much history and meaning.
It really shows you how ingenious and adaptable people were back then. We've seen how they used the long stitch method for centuries, and not just because it was strong and practical, but also because it could be quite beautiful too.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about function. It was about creating something special. And those books weren't just objects. They contained knowledge, stories, ideas that have been passed down through generations.
Exactly. We talked about account books, but imagine all the other types of information that were bound using these methods. Literature, music, scientific discoveries, personal diaries. These books were vessels of human thought and creativity.
It's amazing to think about all the hands that must have touched those books over the years, from the scribes who carefully wrote the words to the people who read them and learned from them, each interaction adding another layer to the book's story.
And that story doesn't end with those historical books. As we've talked about, those old techniques are still alive today. Modern bookbinders are rediscovering them and finding new ways to use them.
It's like a bridge between the past and the present. And it shows that good craftsmanship never really goes out of style. We don't have to just replicate the past. We can learn from it and adapt it to create something new and exciting.
Precisely. The rise of book arts is a perfect example. It's not just about making a functional object anymore. It's about artistry and expression. And historical techniques like the long stitch are playing a big part in that movement.
It's funny how things come full circle, right? The long stitch went from being used for practical things like account books to being used for art journals and high-end photo albums.
It goes to show that good design and craftsmanship are timeless. And it reminds us that we're all connected through the knowledge and skills that have been passed down to us over generations.
That's a really powerful thought. And it brings us back to the heart of why we wanted to do this deep dive in the first place, to uncover the hidden stories in the objects around us. We started with a simple bookbinding technique, but it's opened up a whole world of history and connections.
It just goes to show that history isn't just something you read in a textbook. It's all around us if we know where to look. Sometimes the most ordinary objects have the most extraordinary stories to tell.
That's so true. And as we've learned today, even something as seemingly insignificant as the way a book is bound can teach us a lot about the past, the present, and even the future.
It's a good reminder to pay attention to the little details, the things we might normally overlook. You never know what you might discover.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of archival, long-stitch binding. We've journeyed through time, explored the ins and outs of a centuries-old technique, and discovered how it continues to inspire us today.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you.
The pleasure was all ours. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to see the world around you with fresh eyes. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep those deep dives going. Back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today we're going way back in time, to explore a bookbinding technique that is just as gorgeous as it is historical, long-stitch binding.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. And, you've all been so great about sending us your thoughts, and a lot of you have shared this fascination with handmade books and, that connection to the past and with techniques like this. And this technique really is especially intriguing, I think.
It really is. What I think is so fascinating is that long stitch binding has its roots in the Middle Ages, right? But people still use it. Like today, bookbinders today are still drawn to it.
Yeah.
And I think it just speaks to how powerful craft is and, that desire to create something that will last, something tangible.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this deep dive so cool.
Right.
Because, we're going beyond just looking at pictures of old books, we're going to really unpack this technique.
Yeah.
Understand the history behind it.
Yeah.
And hopefully even inspires some of you guys listening to try it out yourselves.
Absolutely. And I think, we've got some really great sources for this one.
Yeah.
We're looking at a blog post by Lizzie Maid.
Oh, yeah. Great blog.
It's a good one. She goes into a lot of detail, and there are tons of pictures. And then we've got a YouTube series, and these guys are focused on recreating a 14th century long stitch binding.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's really specific, which is cool. And then, we've got an article that's just kind of bookbinding fundamentals, just to make sure we're all on the same page.
Okay. So we've got a good mix of hands-on instruction, history, all that. I like it. So before we get too far into the weeds here, let's talk about what makes long stitch binding. What is it? What makes it unique?
So at its core, long stitch binding is when you're directly sewing the pages. And those pages are put into sections, and those sections are called signatures. And you're sewing those directly to the cover.
Okay.
So unlike, a lot of books you see now that have a separate piece for the spine, with this, the stitching is
part of it.
Part of the design.
Yeah, that's right. And it's funny because, you see this visible stitch, and it goes right along the spine. And that's kind of if you're looking at a book and you're like, is this long stitch? That's one of the ways you can tell.
Yeah. It's a big clue.
And Lizzie has all these great photos on her blog. And
Yeah.
you can especially see it on the leather covers.
Yeah.
It just gives it such a cool look,
It's very striking.
Yeah. Almost like a rustic, old-timey, but in a good way.
Yeah, definitely. And it makes sense because that's, how they used to do it.
Yeah.
That aesthetic is literally historically rooted.
It is.
If you're holding a book that's hundreds of years old, there's a good chance it was bound using that technique.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's wild. And speaking of old books, that's where I think the YouTube series comes in, because they decided to recreate this this binding from the 14th century.
Yes.
Which is so cool, but it's not it's not your typical hardcover, I guess.
It's not your typical hardcover, no.
Yeah.
So this book that they're replicating has what's called a limp parchment cover, which means it's a lot more flexible. It's not a rigid board, it's more flexible.
Oh, gotcha.
And then instead of having a clasp or something to keep it closed, it's got this wraparound flap.
Interesting.
Which is really interesting because when you look at those details, it kind of gives you some clues about how books were used then.
Yeah, that's so true.
What materials did they have? All that kind of stuff. You can start to piece things together.
And even the type of paper. Because I thought it was interesting. The YouTuber mentioned that they couldn't find an exact match for the paper that would have been used in the 14th century.
Right.
But what they did was they chose a paper stock that was thicker, that they thought was pretty similar to what would have been used back then.
Yeah.
And they were talking about swell and how that affects the paper you choose.
Swell is a good thing to bring up here. So swell refers to how much thicker the spine gets when you start sewing the signatures together.
Oh, okay.
So thicker paper, naturally, it's going to create more bulk, right?
Right.
So if you have a really thick spine and you're trying to sew through all those layers,
It's difficult.
it's hard to get those stitches nice and even.
Yeah.
And you want that spine to be nice and smooth. So understanding how the thickness of the paper plays into the swell is like a key part of bookbinding.
It's so cool, though, like just realizing how much goes into it, even with something as, seemingly simple as paper, how thick the paper is. It's so cool.
Yeah.
Makes me want to, like, grab my tools and give it a try.
I know, right?
Let it go.
And that's the beauty of it. You don't need a ton of equipment to get started.
Yeah.
It's pretty accessible.
That's a relief.
Right.
Yeah.
So Lizzie actually walks us through all the different tools that she uses in her blog post, and it's really not that intimidating. Like, you need a bone folder, and awl.
What's an awl?
An awl is just what you use to punch the holes.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
A sturdy needle, that's really important,
Yeah.
And then, of course, your thread. But you probably have some of that lying around.
Probably.
Hopefully.
Somewhere.
Yeah. So it's really not as intimidating as, I think sometimes we think it is.
That's good to know.
Yeah. And she even mentions that you don't have to use leather for the cover.
Right.
She uses leather, but you could use fabric. You could use decorative paper, felt, like whatever you want.
Oh, so now you're getting creative.
Right. Which is fun.
Yeah.
So it gives you a lot of options.
That's cool. She does talk about the spine stiffener, though, right? Like how that's important.
Yes, the spine stiffener is crucial, especially when you're starting out. It basically just gives the spine some structure and support, make sure it's straight, and, it just helps with the sewing process.
So, I mean, it sounds like such a simple thing, but it makes a huge difference.
Huge. It's one of those things that you don't realize how important it is until you don't have it.
Right, right.
And this is where the history part gets extra interesting, too.
Oh, okay. Tell me more.
So in the YouTube series, they actually talk about the history of spine stiffeners, and back in the day, they used all kinds of materials. It wasn't just like one thing.
What do you mean? Like, what else did they use?
We're talking leather, but like leather laminated with parchment to make it extra strong. They used horn,
Wow.
wood,
Yeah. And that was just for the stiffener.
just for the stiffener.
Wild.
Yeah. Can you imagine like having to shape a piece of horn to fit the spine of your book?
It makes you really appreciate the craftsmanship that went into it.
Absolutely.
Because they didn't have, like, pre-made materials
Right.
and all the tools and stuff we have now. Like, they had to be so resourceful.
It's incredible.
So amazing.
They were so connected to the materials, and I don't know, I think it speaks to a different way of thinking about craft. Like, they had to make do with what they had,
Totally.
and that, I think, led to some really creative solutions.
Yeah, it really highlights, like, the art of it all, It wasn't just like, oh, we're going to make a book, slap a cover on it.
Yeah.
Like, they had to really think about the materials, how to use them to make something beautiful, but also that would last.
Right.
Okay, but I'm kind of came like, I want to get into the stitching.
Okay.
Like, what are the steps? What do you have to do to long stitch, bind something?
You're right. We could talk about history forever, but
Well, it's fascinating.
it is. It really is. But let's get back to it.
Okay.
So the Bookbinding Fundamentals article, that one gives us really clear steps.
Yeah. Oh.
It's a good one to follow. And then, of course, Lizzie's blog, she has all those pictures so we can, see it, which is helpful.
For sure. I always need the visuals, for sure.
Yeah, it's good to have both. So you remember we were talking about signatures?
Yeah.
So that's where this starts. It all starts with those folded groups of pages.
Okay.
And remember how we were talking about swell?
Yes. That was so interesting.
Yeah, so you want to keep that in mind when you're putting those signatures together.
Okay.
So the article, it recommends using 6 folios per signature,
Okay.
which is pretty standard. Now, a folio, that might be a new word for some people.
Yeah, breaks down.
It's basically just a sheet of paper that's folded in half.
Okay.
So it gives you 4 pages.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if you have 6 folios, then you've got a signature that's 24 pages.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So once you have all those, stacked nice and neat, the next step is punching the holes.
What, okay, I'll be honest. That's the part that intimidates me a little bit.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know. It seems like a lot of pressure to, get the holes right.
Yeah. You want to make sure they're even.
Exactly.
But it's all about precision and just having a steady hand. You got this.
You think?
I do. The key is to use your awl to make those holes along the spine, the fold line of each signature.
Okay. And they need to be like the right size too, right?
Yes, good
If
point. They need to be big enough to get the needle and thread through, but you don't want them, like, massive either.
Right. Right, of course. That makes sense.
This is where Lizzie has some really good advice in her blog. She talks about how you can actually make a little template.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, so like mark the holes on a piece of, stiff paper,
Yeah.
and then you can just use that as a guide. It'll save you a lot of heartache, trust me.
Especially for a newbie.
Especially for a newbie, for sure.
Okay, so we've got our signatures ready. The holes are punched.
Okay,
Now the stitching.
the main event.
Yes.
This is the long stitch, the heart of it all.
Okay, so what do we do?
So basically, you're sewing those signatures one by one directly onto the cover boards. And that long stitch that you're doing, it runs along the spine. And the article, it really stresses how important it is to keep the tension even.
Oh, right. Yeah. I can see how that would be tricky.
It can be, but it's what gives you that really nice straight spine. You want it to look nice and crisp.
Literally. I'm already, like, picturing the wonky spine if you don't.
Yeah, exactly. But don't worry, as you get going, you kind of find your rhythm. And honestly, that's one of the things I love about long stitch binding is that it's like meditative.
Oh, that's nice.
It is. It's very zen, just watching that spine coming together with each stitch.
I love that. It's like a nice balance between precision and, creativity too. You're following the steps, but there's also, like, you can put your own spin on it.
Oh, for sure.
Speaking of which, on the YouTube series, they talked about some variations, like the link stitch and stuff.
Yes. The link stitch is really cool.
Tell me more about it.
So basically, it's like these extra stitches that link the signatures together. So you're not just sewing through the signature to the cover, but you're also connecting the signatures to each other.
Oh, yeah.
And those stitches can be purely decorative, like just to add a little something extra to the spine.
All right.
Or they can actually make the binding stronger.
Oh, that's cool. I love how, like, just changing up the stitching a little bit can totally change the look.
Totally. And it can make it, more durable too.
That's awesome. I'm, like, already thinking about all the different things you could do. It reminds me of how Lizzie does that braided closure on her journal.
Oh, yeah, that's gorgeous.
I love that little detail.
It's those little touches.
It's so true. Okay, so we've talked about the link stitch and, like, all the different threads you could use. We were talking about spine stiffeners earlier and, like, how they used to use things like horn and wood.
Right, which is crazy.
I was just, like, picturing someone trying to work with horn. That seems, like, really hard.
I know, right?
Like, how did they even do that?
It makes you wonder what tools they were using.
Right.
Because horn is not easy to work with. It's really hard.
Not like leather.
Not at all. So it really makes you appreciate, like, how skilled they were.
They were on a whole other level.
Right. Like, they didn't have pre-made anything. They had to figure it out.
Totally. They were like the original DIers.
The OG DIers, for sure.
I love that. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Seriously. Like, they had to be so innovative just to make a book.
Right. And it makes you think about, like, how we approach making things today. Like, we have it so easy.
Right. We can just go to the store or, like, order anything we need online. They had to really work for it.
Exactly. And it's not just the materials either. It's the knowledge.
You're right.
Like, they couldn't just Google how to make a spine stiffener out of horn. They had to figure it out themselves or, learn from someone else who had figured it out.
It was like a whole apprenticeship thing.
Totally. And that passing down of knowledge, like, that's pretty special. It's like this direct link to the past.
It makes you realize that all those old crafts, they weren't just static. Like, they were constantly changing and evolving as people came up with new ideas, new materials.
Absolutely. I mean, think about those spine stiffeners again. Like, can you imagine going from using leather, which is, pretty flexible, to suddenly working with wood or horn, which are, like, the opposite of flexible?
That's a good point.
Like, that must have been a huge shift.
Totally.
And it probably came with a whole new set of challenges.
For sure. Like, how do you even bend wood to make it fit the spine?
Exactly. But it also probably led to some really cool innovations, Like, maybe they figured out new ways to shape those materials or new designs that they could only do because of those materials.
It's like they were having a conversation.
Yeah.
But, like, through time,
I love that.
each generation building on what came before, but also, like, putting their own spin on it.
That's a great way to put it. And it's true of long stitch binding too, right?
Totally.
It's this technique that's been passed down for centuries, and it connects us to all those bookbinders who came before us.
It's like we're all part of this long line of makers.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't know, I just love that. Like, we're looking at Lizzie's blog and this YouTube series, and even that article, it's all about the fundamentals of bookbinding, but it's more than that, too. It's about that joy of making something with your hands.
Totally. It's about keeping that tradition alive, you
Yeah.
know?
And, like, making it your own.
Exactly. It's not just about, following the rules. It's about bringing your own creativity to it.
100%. So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there anything that really stood out to you? Like, one thing you'll take away from all this?
That's a tough one. I think for me, it's that reminder that simple doesn't have to mean boring. Like long stitch binding, it's a pretty straightforward technique when you get down to it,
Yeah.
but it can create these incredible, like really beautiful and durable bindings.
That's so true.
It's like a good reminder that sometimes the simplest solution is the best one.
I love that. And it makes you think, like, that applies to so many things, not just bookbinding. Like, whatever you're doing, sometimes you just got to go back to basics.
Totally. It's about approaching things with intention, with care.
Yeah.
Like really respecting the craft.
Beautifully said. Well, for those of you listening who are feeling inspired to maybe try long stitch binding yourselves, we'll leave you with this. Don't be afraid to experiment. Play around with different materials, try out those historical techniques. You never know what amazing things you might create. Until next time, happy bookbinding.